Evening, everybody. My name is Kitimbwa, and I am with the Cafè Panafrika. I am delighted to see all of you here today on Cafè Panafrika. Quick story. A few weeks ago, we were thinking about canceling Cafè Panafrika altogether. We think that maybe Afro-Swedish people and Swedish society in general weren't really ready for the kind of discussions that were going on here, because we were losing the audience. So we felt that maybe we should just quit it. But then some wise voices, not my own voice, but my wise voices anyway, told me that no, we can't give it up, because it's not about us. It's not about even the people that come here. It's about all of the African diaspora all over the world, and the fact that we need to connect with that, and we need to be part of the continual struggle of African peoples worldwide, and not just drop it because for a few weeks there haven't been a lot of people. And incredibly enough, people started showing up, like all of you here today. Maybe that has something to do also everything from the ground. You know, we said that we as Africans, we need to be self-sufficient, and this is what it's all about. So instead of going out and buying this stuff with all of the things they put in it to kill our bodies, we make this stuff ourselves. So I would like to introduce you to two ladies that work here also, Zahra and Lul, that came up with the idea that we should do our own baking. So don't hesitate to try some of these delights, because it's truly delicious. Okay, so now we talked about the food, and let's talk about the issue at hand. Tonight we're going to discuss one of the most interesting new developments of the African continent. We're talking about the economical growth of that Africa has seen for the last few decades. And a lot of that has to do with a new player on the world scene in the form of China and Chinese investment in Africa. So whether you like it or not, you can't deny the fact that Chinese investment has something to do with growth in Africa. And this is something that we want to get into here at Cafè Panafrika, where we discuss topics relating to Africa. And to help us do that, we've invited our great friend and brother, Godfrey Kerali, that will go in deep. And as you've seen, he already has his opinion. He thinks that this investment is a benefit to Africa. So he's open and honest with that. But of course, we would love to hear dissenting opinions, other opinions, or just your points of views after the lecture. So without further ado, please, Godfrey, would you like to enter the stage?
Thanks a lot to Mr. Kitimbwa and the audience. As we are running out of time, and given the fact that this topic is one of the most sensitive topics, that will probably lead to so many discussions, questions, and answers, I think it's important that we get straight to the point. Well, the word these days is China, China, China. Everywhere you go is China. If China, for some reason, was a very beautiful woman, I think all the men in the world would want to buy tickets and fly to Beijing. Today's topic is about China investment in Africa, which has literally been known as the dragon's gift, simply because China is associated with the animal we call the dragon. Today's discussion falls into so many parts. the first one will be the background to China's investment in Africa. Just a brief one. Are you all able to read it?
No.
No, it's quite.
Okay. Chinese history and archaeological evidence indicates that China's trade relations with Africa started a long, long time. It dates back to the Han Dynasty of China. That is between 202 AD and between 202 BC to 220 AD. BC is like before Christ, and AD is like after the death of Christ. Well, that was when there were export of goods from Africa to China and the import of Chinese goods to Africa. And if you go to Fort Jesus in Mombasa, I don't know how many people are here from Kenya, they normally have Chinese posters from the 15th century. And these are evidences that the relationship between China and Africa started a long time, not really today, which has been portrayed by some media. I don't know where they got the information from. Well, during the first relationship between China and Africa during the 15th century was on a kind of a small basis and trade related. Then during the 1960s and 1970s, Chinese relations with African countries was driven by what we call ideological considerations, whereby China presented itself as an alternative to both the West capitalism and the Soviet Union. And during that time, China's support consisted mainly of political and material support to fight what we call, to support the anti-colonial liberation struggles in Africa. This was between the 1960s and 70s. Now, but during the 1980s, there was a shift in relationship, which means China-Africa relationship shifted more towards economic cooperation. That was based on, say, common aims in which China attached the importance to both political and economic benefits and portrayed itself as an attractive economic partner and a political friend. Well, in fact, for many African governments, this presented an alternative to what was known as the Washington Consensus. And the Africa-China relation, and China was termed as the Beijing Consensus, as China was going to support Africa without interference in the internal affairs of each and every country. And that is one of the striking features of today's China's investment in Africa. That is, investing, doing trade without interfering in the internal affairs of the African countries. Now, after the end of the Cold War, the United States of America and its Western allies were left in a position of being without rivals or competitors in Africa, given the fact that the Soviet Union had already collapsed. Which means they had no competition in acquiring the resources from Africa, and this gave them the ability to basically control Africa and control the economies of Africa through what you call the economic blackmail. You have the money, and someone who doesn't have the money has to obey your orders or has to kneel before you. Well, this also left them with a monopoly of finance, which means any African country that needed finance had to go to the United States of America and the Western allies. However, the rise of China actually changed the equation, changed the game, actually permanent, in the sense that African countries now had an alternative to sources of finance and trading partners. China began to increase significantly investing in Africa when the Western countries, for some reasons, started withdrawing from Africa. I could attribute one of the reasons for their withdrawal to be maybe the so many wars, the civil wars that were fought in the continent between 1970 and 1990. There were so many devastating civil wars within Africa. That could have been one of the reasons. China had actually not been so active in the global markets during those days. Not until the beginning of the new millennium, more specifically until when it joined the World Trade Organization, because China, for some reasons, had not joined the World Trade Organization. And then after joining the World Trade Organization, China actually initiated what we call the going global policy of promoting overseas investments, that is investing outside China. Now, the policy was conceived to compete for what we call to compete for a share in the global market and resources, because China saw the need to also join the global market, not to compete, not to get share of the resources of the different countries of the world, be it in Africa, South America, Europe, or in the United States of America. And today, China is one of the biggest investors in the United States of America. As a result, Chinese investment increased, for instance, from 911 million US dollars. That is in 2002. That's the amount it invested in Africa. Then by 2010, China had invested an equivalent of 68 billion US dollars, which is quite a sizable amount of investment. Now, the second part of the presentation is about the background to China's rise as a global economic power. How did China from nowhere rise up to become a power, which today is actually almost outcompeting the United States of America as the largest economy in the world? Well, in the early 1970s, China was indeed a large but very poor country, and at the same time resource rich. Resource rich in the sense that it had large reserves of coal. And it was just emerging from periods of violent conflicts and cultural revolution in China. All of you must have heard about the revolution in China, Cultural Revolution, and the wars, like during before the 1940s. Now, China, in the 70s, China was still emerging or recovering from the violent conflicts. Now, China had large reserves of coal. Then it decided to focus on development. So how was that going to happen? One is they thought that they should modernize their infrastructures, which means building roads, railways, importing new technology, and figure out how to get more coal from the mines. And all this needed a lot of money, and China did not have the money at the time. Then suddenly they had a visitor. This visitor was quite a large and wealthy Asian nation by then, by the time China was still poor. This country was already an importer of Chinese coal, but it needed a lot more than that. And this country I'm talking of is Japan. Then Japan decided to offer China a bargain. And the bargain was that Japan would offer China a credit line worth 10 billion US dollars under the following terms. It's like if you go out and borrow money from the bank, you'll always have terms. These are the interest rates you have to pay. And you have to pay it every month, maybe on the 25th. We all know how you pay your credits. So these were the following terms for which Japan granted China credit worth $10 billion. One, China would import Japanese technologies. Then Japanese companies would build China's infrastructure, the roads, railways, and ports. Then they would also develop China's mines. Now, in return, China was to pay back Japan with their oil, with their coal, because China had large reserves of coal. Then China therefore had access to Japanese technologies, and Japan had access to Chinese coal. In a way, China didn't need to spend much. It was a kind of a barter trade, exchange of goods for goods. Now, China agreed to the bargain, and work began. And that is why China is what it is today. Now, we have all heard about China's investment in Africa. So what does it mean to invest in a country? Or what are the forms of investment? Because investment always takes different forms. Now, these are the three basic types of investment that China has undertaken in Africa. The first one is barter trade, which is basically the exchange of goods for goods and services. Maybe if I have 4 goats, then I need a car. I'll give you the goats, then I get the car. not giving you the cash directly because I may not have the cash. But it may be expensive for me to buy dollars if you want me to buy your cars in dollars, which means I have to go and buy the dollars from somewhere expensively and pay you. But instead of that, if we come to an agreement that I'll give you four goods, then you give me the car. That is what we call barter trade. The second form of China's investment in Africa is through what we call foreign direct investment. This is basically, this refers to an investment to acquire a lasting or long-term interest in enterprises operating outside within an economy. The investment is direct because the investor actually goes into a different country and then puts his money in, be it the companies or the economy, then seeks to control the company or the economy, manage it, and have significant influence over the foreign enterprise. And that is what China is doing in Africa. The third type of investment is what we call the concessional loans. We have all heard about loans. Say, United States of America or Britain or France granting a loan to an African country. But concessional loan is quite different from the normal market loan in the sense that they are mostly provided at very low interest of rate. That is basically below the market price, below the market rate. If a normal loan is granted at 20%, concessional loan would fall way below that, say at about 5%. And the idea is to grant it to poor countries of the world. So that is what has actually made China to win the hearts of many African countries. I'll offer you, loans at very low interest. Now, how does China do business in Africa? I've already given you the background to China's rise as an economic power. Now, what China is doing in Africa is just replicating its model of economic growth and development. That is what Japan did to China. It's what China is actually doing in Africa. That is replicating the model of investment and economic growth. Well, what is the nature of China's investment in Africa? It's just simple, non-complex, and clear. China comes in and says, okay, look, we have the experts, we have the technology, and we have the finance. So China comes in well equipped with a complete investment package. It's like if I give you 10 million crowns today, that go and invest it, but you don't have the technology and you don't have the expertise. So what will you do? The money may end up, in very different projects whereby it may not even profit you in the future. But China offers the whole package that I have the money, I have the technology, and I have the expertise. So China gives you everything. Now, in return, African countries pays China back in terms of by giving them the oil, gas, the mineral resources like maybe gold, diamonds, coal, and this is what we call the barter trade. And this, in a way, is cheap for African countries to manage simply because China doesn't require them to buy dollars expensively from the world market and pay Chinese dollars. Now, an example of China's investment package in Africa is, okay, we'll build 600 kilometers of road. You have got the technology, so you just have to agree on when China should come in and start the work. Not that we shall start the work after 5 years or after 2 years. China just asks you, are you ready? Then as soon as you say you are ready, they come in with all the investment package and start the work. Now they bring in all the equipments, but sometimes they have to work with the local contractors who know about the African conditions. Now when it comes to repaying the money, because of course if you borrow money you need to know when you have to repay it and how long you have to pay it. But China will tell you, don't worry, simply because it's a concessional loan. And why did China do that? China has already figured that by 2006, China figured out that the population of Africa will reach 1 billion. And that is a sizable market. Because China produces a lot of electronic equipment, consumer products, very cheaply. And China is in need of markets for its products. So China knows that if I can win the hearts of Africans, I will win the markets. That is why it doesn't stress the African governments to pay back its loans, because it knows what it will gain in future. In addition to that, another nature of China's business in investment in Africa is that it will never interfere into the internal affairs of the country. And that's why they have won the hearts of Africans. Now, at the same time, many African countries are still in the process of developing. That's why we call them slow developing countries or low developing countries, but not less developed countries, but the low developing countries that are still in the process. Many of African countries probably they lack the indigenous, say, in the engineering capacity or maybe the technology, and that is why it's actually right for China to go and invest in Africa. And China invests mostly in infrastructure, which means roads, railways, ports, tunnels, highways, flyways, and airports. And these are exactly what we need in Africa. Now, what are the benefits of China's investment in Africa? We know that China invests heavily in infrastructure, which Africa needs. Well, Africa has had an infrastructure deficit of about $75 billion. What do we mean by infrastructure deficit? Which means Africa does not have the infrastructure, I mean the roads, waterways, the railways, that is needed in order to drive forward industrial development or in order to grow an economy.
Can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
When you talk about benefits, is it benefits for Africa or for China? What do we
At the moment, it's the benefits for Africa, because that's the basic of the topic. Although we all know that China will definitely benefit as a major investor. Africa has an infrastructure deficit, which means Africa has not, many countries in Africa have not had the roads that are required. For instance, if you look at Sweden, the road network in Sweden and the rail network in Sweden, the aeroplanes and the airports, compared to many countries in Africa, you'll see that the gap is quite a lot. And Africa has had that deficit of about 75 billion. The deficit is measured in terms of money simply because that is the amount of money that is required to build that infrastructure, to fill the gap so that Africa can also drive forward in terms of industrial development. Well, African countries together, maybe together with the World Bank and African Development, they can actually raise an amount of money, but they can only raise up to about $45 billion. So China just came to fill in the gap. Between 2006 and 2002, China invested more than $10 billion only on infrastructure. That is roads, railways, bridges, tunnels, and again, hospitals, housing, shopping centers, and the rest. And this is exactly what Africa needs. Imagine if there were no roads in Sweden, as we have it today. The cost of products will be high. The cost of food will be high. And that is what exactly is happening in Africa. Now, China came in and filled the gap. That is why today, if you go to Africa, at least you will be able to see highways, flyways, tunnels. Someone I know actually lived in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. He lived abroad for about 10 years. When he went back, he got lost. He couldn't know where to go because the whole city had changed. Now China has invested heavily in infrastructure. And there are concrete evidences of Chinese investment in Africa, which I have 2 video clips that I'll show you. And that is just a piece of the iceberg. You can just go into YouTube or Google and see for yourself what is actually happening in Africa. And unfortunately, what we term like the Western media did not play that role of showing a very positive side of Africa. Africa has only been portrayed as a dark continent, a lot of hunger, poverty, shortage of water, everything negative you can think about, not knowing that the good side of Africa is even there. And it's only China that discovered that. Well, China has developed the infrastructures in Africa, And what are the advantages of good roads and rail network that has attracted investment? Now that China has built a lot of roads, rail network in Africa, investors from other parts of the world are now rushing to Africa. Because if China builds a road from, say, from Kampala up to Kasese, where we have copper belt, where the copper belt is, every investor will want to go and invest in Uganda because it will be easy to exploit the copper, process it, exploit it, and export it. But if you don't have the good roads, no one will actually go there. You need roads in order to do trade. Within a country, you need roads in order to do interstate trade. Like now, it's easier to travel between Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. It's easy to travel between Sierra Leone, some of these West African countries, because they actually built a good network of roads and railways. And it was actually China that did that. And China is actually planning to invest like about $9 billion only in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The reason is to open up all the southern flank, that is the southern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, because that is one of the richest countries in the world in terms of mineral resources, but because of the war, they are not being able to exploit that fully. So China is investing about $9 billion in the DRC. Then the former president of Congo, the late Mobutu, he embezzled $9 billion for his own use, which he banked in Switzerland. And that $9 billion could have done a lot. So in a way, China has gone to save the country. Now, energy. China also invests a lot in energy. What do you mean by energy? By energy, we mean, say, power. And China actually has experts in building hydroelectric power stations to generate electricity. And Africa is blessed because we have a lot of waterfalls in any country. Like if you go to River Matadi in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, has the capacity to supply electricity all over the continent. That is River Matadi alone. In Uganda, you have the Karuma Falls. In Kenya, you have it. In Sudan, they have it. In Ethiopia, they have it. Now, within the last 5-6 years, China built about 10 hydroelectric power stations in Africa. 2 in Ghana and 3 in Ethiopia. And then continue. We have, China has pumped a lot of money in, say, the best example is this, China state-owned oil companies that are active throughout the continent. The China National Petroleum Corporation, for instance, invested $6 billion in Sudan's oil sector, in southern Sudan and both South Sudan. And the China Power Investment Corporation had invested $6 billion in Guinea's bauxite. Bauxite is a mineral that is refined to produce aluminium, and aluminium is used to manufacture the aircrafts, spoons, knives, and forks that we use around here. And in Guinea alone, it's investing between $6 and $7 billion US. How about in the manufacturing sector? China is also investing a lot in the manufacturing sector. And for instance, we have car assembly plants in.
Can I just interrupt a little bit?
Yes.
Yeah. In comparison to other countries that have similar interests in Africa, like China, would you give some examples that make China much more better? Because I would like to hear something compare to be able to know that maybe this is better than that.
Yeah,
in some of these examples you have mentioned.
Well, that is part of the discussion which shall reach me later. And then after the discussion, there are questions. You'll be given time to ask questions. Then I will answer. Any of you who has a better answer can answer that. And probably your question actually is in the presentation itself. Say maybe after about the 5th or the 6th slide. So that is when probably I'll get to that. China's also invested in manufacturing. We have car assembly plants in Angola, and they're planning one in Kenya, to have one in Kenya. And all this will create employment. Then there also, China is creating what we call the free economic zones. By free economic zones, we mean you build up a zone whereby you invite companies from from abroad, like from UK, from China, to come and settle in your country. They'll not pay tax. If they have to pay tax, then maybe the rate of tax will be low. The reason being that China did the same thing. That is why there are so many companies going to China, because the cost of production is low, simply because the free trade zone area is tax-free. I think Volvo is also in China. Then GM, you have GM, the General Motors American company, is also in China. And they all went and settled down at one Chinese the free economic zones. Now, China has also invested heavily in telecommunications. Given the population of Africa, Africa has about 1 billion people, and that's a sizable market for telecommunications. I mean, the mobile phones, the internet usage, and the rest. Now, China's biggest telecommunication companies are like the Huawei and the ZTE. These are the major telecommunication companies operating in Africa. And if you go to Africa today, you find people have so many mobile phones. And that is actually the market that Africa has provided China. China has also invested in financial institutions, what we call the service industry. For instance, China purchased about 20% of South Africa's Standard Bank, which is worth $5.5 billion US. And that is quite a lot of money and a lot of investment, which has actually created so many jobs. All these points that I've gone through, that is the infrastructure, the energy, the mining sector, the manufacturing, the telecommunications, the employment, and all these are the advantages or the benefits of China's investment in Africa. At the same time, China's investment has resulted in employment for Africans. Because they have invested in infrastructure, energy, mining, financial institutions, or maybe banks, this employs between 70 to 80% of the local labor force. Now, continuing with the benefits of China's investment in Africa. There's a strong argument that by some schools of thought that China's investment has actually helped to curb down or to fight off corruption in Africa. We all know, during those days, corruption is everywhere, not only in Africa. Even in Europe, there's corruption. Go to Russia, even in China, corruption is everywhere. Unfortunately, I strongly believe that corruption is everywhere. Unfortunately, in Africa, corruption is more visible simply because the continent is not yet fully developed. For instance, if today the government of Sweden invests 5 million crowns in constructing a road or maybe in maintaining a road, then if someone embezzles 4 million crowns, we shall not see it because Sweden already has a well-developed network of roads and railways. But if Africa has $4 million, then someone embezzles $3 million and the government is left with only $1 million. Corruption will be visible because no roads will be constructed. Now, how does China's investment help to curb down or help to reduce the level of corruption in Africa? This is how it happens. Usually when China signs an infrastructure project deal with an African country, the money is put into an account in Beijing, in China, not in Africa. Then a list of infrastructure projects are drawn up, say roads, railways are drawn up, while in China, after the list is drawn up, Chinese companies, because as I told you earlier, they have the expertise, the money, and the technology. They'll come with the technology and the expertise to Africa. Then the Chinese companies are given contracts to come and build the roads in Africa. Then these funds are transferred into the bank accounts of the Chinese companies in China. But they already signed the deal with Africa, simply because if the money lands in Africa, it will just disappear. So the money will be in Beijing. China pays it construction companies. Then these construction companies flies to Africa with about 5 to 10% of the expertise of the labor force. Then they will start building the roads. And that is why we are able to see the roads in Africa now. Because the money is not there in Africa, which should have disappeared, but the money is in China. the construction companies from China will build the roads because they already have the money in China. For some reasons, this has enabled Africa to see that the investments are actually visible on the ground. That is the concrete evidence that it's happening on the ground. Now, foreign direct investment, it helps in the sense that when investors invest in a company in an African country, it will be co-owned, which means there will be no corruption. Because the foreign investors will have the power and influence that, okay, we need this kind of manager, we need people who are qualified, we need good auditors and accountants so that the money will not disappear into individual pockets. Now, China's investment in Africa has also enabled African countries to save millions of dollars in the field of the expertise. Why do African countries save a lot of money? They save a lot of money because of China's business approach and China's investment attitude. And what is this attitude? One, it's simple. Chinese experts, they don't fly business class or first class, they fly economy class. Whether it's a professor in engineering, a professor in environmental science, they'll fly economy. And that has saved them a lot, because should they fly business class, African countries have to pay for that. And that is their attitude and approach to their investment in Africa. Second, they don't live in Chinese experts working on roads and houses. They prefer to stay at the construction sites, in what we call, the small houses you build at the construction sites. That is where they prefer to stay, either there or in cheap accommodations locally. They can rent a house, then so many people, Chinese experts, will stay in it. Which means they don't live in expensive 5-star hotels. They prefer to live at the construction sites and in cheap accommodations. In that way, it has saved the governments of Africa a lot of money, because should they live in 5-star hotels like Sheraton or maybe Hilton, the African governments have to pay for that. And that is the philosophy of Chinese investment. Investment in China also reduced poverty, in the sense that it has been argued that for every 1% growth in China, 30% of people outside China will be lifted out of poverty. And I've seen that. I come from a small town in Uganda known as Nebi district, close to the DRC. I know of 15 young boys who have now become millionaires simply because they have had the chance to do business with China. During those days, it was difficult to fly to China, but these days they can fly to China, they can fly to Dubai. And that is an advantage. 1% growth in China every year leads to poverty reduction by 30% around the world, not only in Africa. But in this case, we take Africa as a case study. Continuing, why is the trade with China benefiting Africa? One, China understood that Africa has so many products. Now what it did, it abolished all the export duties on Africa. If you export your product somewhere, you have to pay tax on it. China decided to abolish the tax on 400 different products of Africa, which means Africa can sell all those 400 products in China and a lot of revenue, because they will not pay export duties on these products. And that is how China's managed to win the hearts of Africa. Now, Chinese imports from Africa now equals about $93 billion. That is how much China spends to import goods from Africa. Apart from investing in Africa, building roads, railways, and houses, China also imports products because it has a huge population for about 1.35 billion people. And that's a sizable market for Africa. That is how Africa gains, because Africa sells its products to a huge Chinese market, which is about $1 to $3 billion. Then China also is seeking an extra market for its manufactured goods. They manufacture, mobile phones, cars, motorcycles, and Africa actually offers this. The advantage to Africa is that China produces these goods cheaply, and when they sell it to Africa, they'll also sell it cheaply. For instance, the iPhone that we use in Sweden, or the Samsung Galaxy, probably manufactured in Sweden, it will have a higher price because of the cost of production in Sweden. You have to pay the rent where your factory is, which is high. And in Sweden, we pay a lot of VAT, what we call the MOMS. It's high. So everything is expensive, and that leads to a high cost of production. And that is where China beats all countries of the West. Now, if you take an iPhone from Sweden and you go and sell it in any African country, at the market price in Sweden, that will be too way expensive for an African to afford. But China will produce this Huawei telephone, ZTE. Instead of selling it at 5,000 Swedish crowns in Africa, it will sell it at 500 crowns instead of 5,000 Swedish crowns. So in a way, it has improved the quality of life of Africans. So many countries in Africa sell agricultural products and fisheries to China, like Burkina Faso, Benin, and Mali supply about 20% of China's need for cotton. 20% of cotton that China needs comes from Benin in West Africa, Burkina Faso in West Africa, and also Mali in West Africa. Then Ivory Coast supplies China with almost all its needs for cocoa. China needs a lot of cocoa. Then Ivory Coast actually exports a lot of cocoa to China. Large shipments of coffee are imported from Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, all to China, because China has actually offered them a better price as well. Now, trade with China, as I said, has resulted in cheap and affordable manufactured consumer goods, like basically electronic products, smart mobile phones that, the touch screen. China produces them cheaply because the cost of production in China is low. The cost of labor in China is low. So they produce something that the rest of the world, which are not extremely rich, can afford. Now, what is driving China's investment in Africa? Its population, of course, 1.4 billion people. That's quite a lot. And if China doesn't invest in outside Africa, outside China, and in China, this population will one time burst and will cause a lot of revolution, because people will want to be looked after. So, in a way, China actually is being pushed forward by its increasing population. Because it has to invest, it has to generate a lot of revenue, invest in China, and create jobs for its population. That is why there are so many problems in South America, in Africa, because we have the young generation, a lot of population, people who are unemployed. It becomes actually easy for them. They're actually prone to committing crimes. It's easy for them to be deceived. Let us go to the bush and fight this government. We go and we rob this bank, we do this. So if China doesn't do that, same revolutions going on around the world will start in China. Special economic zones is what I actually hinted on before, that these are the free trade areas whereby China has encouraged Africa to develop, so that so many countries from around the world will converge in different sites in Africa, which is specifically being created. Like in Nigeria, it's known as the Lekki Free Trade Zone. In Angola, it's known as the Luanda Bengo Free Trade Zone. And we have them in Ghana, they're creating some as well. So countries that are going to invest in these free trade zones will not pay tax. They love, the right to take in like 20 to 30 or 40% of the labor force. Now we have talked about the advantages, the benefits of investment, of Chinese investment in Africa. There's no doubt there are bottlenecks, maybe the negative parts of Chinese investment in Africa. And again, the criticisms of China's investment in Africa. Unfortunately, there are some bottlenecks, because China is a kind of a new investor in Africa. It doesn't know much, about the many countries in Africa. And again, the bad thing is that the criticisms of China's investment in Africa, unfortunately, is coming from the West. And I could see that as maybe they are afraid to compete with China in Africa because of Chinese success. China has $3 trillion in reserve, and that is the money China is investing in Africa, South America, and the States is just a click of that $3 trillion it has in reserves. So China has a lot of money, which means it can push prices downwards. That's why it's winning the hearts of people around the world. Between 70 and 80% of Africans support China's investment in Africa. So what are some of the criticisms of the bottlenecks? This is how I decided to design it. The bottlenecks or the criticisms of China's investment in Africa. At the same time, I'll counter this criticism because I believe that Chinese investment has helped to shoot up Africa from a level Africa was from say 1990s up to now. I think we actually have to appreciate China for that. So, but one of the bottlenecks is that private Chinese companies, because China, we have Chinese, the state-owned companies and the private companies. For instance, Swedish-owned companies and private companies which are not at all tied to or affiliated to the Swedish government can all invest in the country, and that is what China is doing. State-owned companies and private companies from China, because they have also seen the opportunity. They have seen the window of opportunity that their government has opened up. These private Chinese companies, not the state-owned Chinese companies, that are suffocating and are forcing local businesses to collapse in Africa. This is because they go in with a less little capital, and eventually they become very aggressive to the business. Then they force the local businesses to close. And this has been one of the biggest problems in Africa. So when when the local companies in African countries are forced to close, it will create unemployment. It will actually ensure that people will not earn more than they used to earn. And these are the things that bring a lot of political discontent. People start, there are situations whereby Africans in some countries have been fighting the Chinese physically, threatening them that they have to be killed, and sometimes they have to hire security forces in order to protect the business premises. Well, these are actually Chinese private retail companies and not the state-owned companies that I'm saying. So it doesn't mean that it's the problem of China. The government of China doesn't have control over the private companies. Like if a company from Sweden, which is privately owned, goes to Africa, it has nothing to do with the state with the government of Sweden. What it's doing will be all, it will be its own making. It has to abide by the laws. If it doesn't abide by the laws, the country has the right to take it to court. But unfortunately, there has been a generalization that these are all Chinese companies. But you really have to differentiate between Chinese state-owned companies, which are doing the right thing, and the Chinese privately owned companies. Now there has also been accusation that China employs only Chinese skilled workers, not African graduates. Well, China employs between 70 and 80% of the labor force from Africa. But as an investor, you are allowed to come in with your labor force. China provides the expertise. They provide the technology. So they are actually right to come in with their expertise and the labor. Say about 30%, that's actually acceptable. But beyond that would bring a kind of, a disagreement with African countries and the people of Africa. Well, there are 92,000 Portuguese living and working in Angola. There's nothing wrong with that. The Portuguese are not complaining. But when it comes to China, why should the world complain? And that's why you see that the argument is actually one-sided. Africans are not complaining about the Portuguese living there because they are contributing to economic growth and development of Angola. Now, at the same time, when they talk about African graduates, we mean students who have come raw after the university. I one time sparked off a debate on Facebook about Chinese investment in Africa, that, okay, welcome China, they should build our roads. Then one guy told me, okay, China comes in with the experts. Where will the African graduates work? I told him, look, we have graduates from the university directly. They have not seen what a highway is. How do you expect him to be employed to maintain the highway, to provide the building of a highway? My argument was that let China go to Africa, build the highways, let these graduates be taken from the university campus to go and see what a highway looks like, what a flyway looks like, and that will motivate them that, okay, this is what I have to maintain in future. And in addition to that, China has to accept and train these graduates about maintaining roads and highways, about building, railway network, because it won't work. Bring in a graduate who has not seen a highway. What will he do? He'll just look at it and run away. bring a graduate who has not seen an invoice in an office, give him an invoice, he's just going to throw it away because he doesn't know what to do with it. Anyway, that is my argument, that anyone has the right to his or her own opinion. There has been an argument that there are so many Chinese actually have been underpaying the African labor well, and that they offer unfavorable terms of payments and and the conditions. However, that is not a problem. The most important issue is China has created the jobs. Now it has to be the work of the African governments to design labor laws, to design laws that should protect the labor force. In Sweden, you have laws protecting you, because many people in Sweden are like members of the trade union and the rest. The labor laws in Sweden. In Sweden, you have the minimum wage, a wage at which the standard wage whereby you must pay someone. Below which you're actually committing a crime. You will be going against the labor law. And that's what the governments of Africa have to do. Not that China is underpaying them. The terms of employment are unfavorable, or maybe they're working long hours. That is what the governments of Africa have to do, because China has invested and created the jobs. So they have to ensure that the jobs that China has created will be offered to the Africans who want favorable terms. It's not the work of China, because China is an investor. And China comes in with its own conditions, because China, as we see, China is still developing compared to Sweden, United States of America. So the labor laws in China are the labor laws that they're actually applying when it comes to the workers that they employ in Africa. And that is what the governments of Africa have to look into. They have created the jobs, so we think people should not complain much, except that they have to be advised, okay, this is how we do things in Africa. Because being a former French, British colonies, we have adopted the labor laws from Britain and there in Africa. So this is what you have to follow. Otherwise, they will not follow it, because they're also after money. We all know that China, an investor goes after money. There has been argument that China cares less about the environment where they invest, especially in Africa. So what are some of the examples? Some of the examples has been overexploitation of African resources. There are two basic examples. One, overexploitation of timber in Botswana, in Gabon and Guinea, whereby Chinese companies had been given the right, or maybe on their own, overexploiting, cutting down the trees without planting more. And that is not the problem of China, because it's coming to invest. It also needs this product. So this is again is the problem of the African countries. They have to ensure that they have environmental laws to protect the environment of Africa. You bring in an investor, you need to give him the terms that will work under these terms. 20 acres of land, you can harvest maybe half of that. Then plant more trees. Another issue has been shark fishing. Namibia lies along the coast. Then they have a lot of shark. And China consumes a lot of shark every year, about 3 million tons. So that has led to overexploitation of shark. And that is not the problem with China again. It's the government to protect its own environment, despite the fact that China is investing. They should not fear China that, okay, he has come with a lot of money. We should keep quiet. If anything goes wrong, they have to step up and tell them, no, the condition that will not interfere in the internal politics of Africa. I think that's why China has been able to do business with any government in Africa, with any government in the world, including China actually invests in countries that recognize Taiwan as a state. That's where you see that China is a good investor. The best example or a case study is Guinea, whereby we have the military junta. They overthrew a democratically elected government of Guinea. Then at the same time, China invested $7 billion in the mining and oil exploration sector in Guinea. That is being headed by the military junta. Now the West came up, the human rights organization, that no, you cannot do that. At the same time, there are 3 big Western companies in Guinea also doing business with the military junta. And which are these companies? The Anglo-Australian company known as Rio Tinto. It's a company jointly owned by Britain and Australia. It's also doing business with the military junta in Guinea. We have the American company known as the Alcoa. It's also doing business with the military junta in Guinea. Then we also have Russian-owned company known as the Russo is also doing business. So why is it so that the criticism has been directed only towards China? That is where I see that the argument that China's funds and investment supports corrupt and dictatorial governments in Africa is actually one-sided. And at the same time, corruption has been there for a long time. So many African leaders have actually embezzled money and put it in banks outside Africa. Then China's investment has led to the creation of ghost towns, whereby China has built so many houses that they have not been actually occupied. And they consider that as a waste of investment. The question now is China a better trade and investment partner for Africa? Well, probably we shall come to that one later. And it's just some few clips that I wanted to show you before we come to the end of the discussion. Yep. You watch this and have your say. This is
Crystal sun.
Superhighway Kenya, which has been recently constructed. And prior to that, we saw the housing construction in Angola. Ladies and gentlemen, with this, we come to the end of the presentation. And probably should take a quick break, about 50 minutes, after which you'll be free to ask questions.
Yes, as Godfrey was saying, we take a 10-minute break, and after that, Godfrey will be here, and I will moderate a discussion on what has been told. A very strong plea in favor of Chinese investment in Africa. As always here at Cafè Panafrika, there are room for dissenting voices, as long as they are from a Pan-African point of view. So, in 10 minutes.